Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien students spent years on this project, the human finished it in a week. The halls of the Galactic Academy buzzed with the ambient hum of alien languages and interstellar excitement. The lecture chambers, carved into the cliffs of Aeon 7, overlooked a frozen ocean that never melted. It was the first day of the Advanced Interspecies Communication course, led by the legendary Professor Xyler, an insectoid being with 6 gleaming eyes and a crystalline voice that echoed through sound, color, and vibration. His lectures were notoriously difficult, often bordering on the incomprehensible for those unprepared. Many dropped out within the first week, only the most determined dared to remain. Professor Xyler floated into the room on a gravity disk, his elongated limbs folded like praying branches. The students, seated in levitating pods arranged in a spiraling tower formation, quieted as he transmitted the task directly into their neural receivers. The instructions were also spoken aloud for the benefit of the few species incapable of direct neural link, among them one human, Mark Diaz. Mark sat in the lowest pod closest to the professor. He was the only representative of Earth in the entire course, and his presence had been questioned by many when the academic year began. Humans were still considered novelties in the galactic academic world, curious, yes, emotionally unpredictable, definitely, capable of mastering the intricacies of cross-linguistics. Most believed the answer was no. Professor Xyler's voice resonated with a chilling calm as he laid out the challenge. "You are to construct a fully functioning universal translator," he declared, his tones layered in tertiary frequencies that only the translator implants could parse. It must detect, decode, and communicate across all known Class 4 and Class 5 languages. Completion deadline, 7 planetary cycles. A rustle of energy spread through the room. Some students clicked their mandibles in excitement, others blinked in harmonic pulses. A universal translator wasn't just a difficult assignment, it was practically a rite of passage for galactic linguists. Yet no one had ever completed it in such a short time frame. 7 planetary cycles equaled approximately 1 Earth week. Even the most advanced machine learning cores needed at least 2 cycles to train for a single dialect. The students began downloading data from the Academy's central core. Light trails and holographic screens enveloped their pods. Some, like the Glut twins, 2 bulbous silicon-based life forms, had already deployed code sequences. Others, like the telepathic Arvian named Sohn, mapped ephemeric webs in midair using a complex symbology drawn from her native thought forms. The room turned into a storm of activity, charts, equations, and linguistic roots lit up the curved chamber like a neural supernova. Mark did none of that. He simply leaned back in his seat and observed. He watched the way Professor Xyler moved when speaking certain phrases. He noted the subtle delay when the audio translation caught up to the visual cue. He observed how the insectoid's limbs gestured differently depending on the target species of the statement. Every species in the room had their own translation rhythm, and he began mentally cataloging the patterns. When the class ended, the others remained in their pods, hunched over data streams, refining code and running simulations. Mark stood up and left. He didn't carry a tablet or bring a headset. He didn't request access to the language data sets. Instead, he wandered into the Academy's central plaza, a sprawling space lined with crystalline benches, artificial waterfalls, and atmospheric controlled domes that simulated the preferred climates of various species. There, he sat beside a tall, feathered female called Marasha, a student from the planet Kaner. Her species communicated using song, a melodic blend of clicks, hums, and pitch shifts that most translators struggled to render into coherent meaning. She had struggled for years with getting her language properly encoded into any database, and most of the students avoided her due to the sheer difficulty of communicating. But not Mark. He smiled and listened. He didn't interrupt or scan her with a device. He just listened. She chirped hesitantly at first, unsure if he even understood. Then, after a while, he repeated a sound she had made earlier. It was imperfect, slightly off pitch. She laughed. He tried again, adjusting. She nodded, encouraged, and then, like a stream breaching a dam, a conversation, clumsy but genuine, began. For hours, he engaged with various beings around the plaza, a three-eyed Zarian who spoke in rapid bursts of air pressure modulation, a stoic Alanian who only communicated in rhythmic pulses across a light-emitting organ on his chest. Mark studied their expressions, their gestures, their tone. He didn't aim for perfection, he aimed for connection. Back in the student quarters, the others mocked him. Solon called it primitive anthropology. One of the Glut twins suggested that he was wasting time on organic roleplay. But Mark didn't argue. He spent his nights replaying the sounds and symbols in his mind. He drew charts on the wall with markers, color-coded and annotated. He linked sounds to emotions, gestures to syntax. He slept with a journal open beside him, waking up in the middle of the night to scribble down a newly remembered vowel shift or tonal drift. By the third day, something strange began to happen. When Misasa sang her greetings to another classmate, Mark responded with the appropriate return gesture and got it right. When the Aluan paused mid-light pulse in a conversation with another professor, Mark blinked at the precise moment to signal comprehension. Some began to notice. Professor Zeiler passed Mark once in the corridor and paused just long enough to emit a faint vibration, a form of acknowledgement in his species. Mark mimicked it in return. The professor's left eye twitched. It was the first sign of surprise Mark had seen in the otherwise unreadable face. Mark didn't see what he was doing as genius, to him, it was instinct. His grandfather had been a jazz musician. He remembered sitting at the old man's feet, watching him improvise songs on the piano, adapting to the rhythm of the room. Communication, to Mark, was like jazz. It wasn't about translating word for word, it was about reading the moment, the pulse, the tone, the silence between the notes. The rest of the students pushed deeper into code. Some created recursive logic trees, others trained AI with millions of simulated dialogues, still others downloaded entire language libraries and cross-referenced the phonetics with historical patterns. Mark. He spent time in the academy kitchens, listening to the slang of the working staff. He played games with the maintenance bots, which had their own simplified command language. He even sat through a council hearing just to observe how diplomacy distorted formal speech. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't recognized. Yet by the end of the first week, most students had prototypes, shiny, blinking devices with audio channels, display interfaces, and lines of compressed data ready to be tested. Mark had nothing physical to show, no device, no code, just a notebook filled with sound patterns and handwritten notes. He submitted it with no fanfare. Some laughed behind his back. Sohn openly scoffed and muttered something in Arvian that she assumed he couldn't understand. But he did. He turned to her and replied in fluent, if imperfect, Arvian, let's see whose method speaks louder. Her face froze, her luminous markings flickering in alarm. Mark smiled and walked away. The real test hadn't even begun. The air in the Academy's linguistic wing had shifted. There was a quiet intensity that settled over the corridors, as if the walls themselves were listening. Mark noticed it but said nothing. He had become accustomed to the glances, some curious, others suspicious, especially after his quiet display of understanding during his exchange with Sohn. Yet he didn't respond to stares or whispers. He had no need to prove anything. Not yet. He entered the semi-private study pod he had claimed earlier in the week. Unlike the other students who had transformed their assigned workspaces into miniature research labs, Mark's pod remained bare. There were no blinking lights, no code streaming across screens, just a simple desk, a wall-mount interface that he never touched, and the journal he always carried with him. That journal had become his map, his language, and his companion. He opened it and reviewed the previous day's notes. He had broken down a complex sentence structure used by the Zarian clerk in the cafeteria. The pattern of breath intervals embedded within the clicks revealed a rhythm Mark hadn't initially caught. Once he recognized it, the rest of the syntax began to unfold like a melody. He adjusted a few notations and muttered the sentence aloud, shifting the pressure in his voice to match what he had observed. After verifying the sounds, he left the pod. He had no interest in studying in isolation. The academy was a living network of dialects and nuances, and no artificial environment could substitute for the real thing. Mark's method relied on immersion, and that meant stepping into the places where real conversations happened, places where language wasn't just spoken but lived. He headed toward the atrium, where species from across the galaxy congregated between lectures. This time, he sat beside a young mechanic named Ray, a reptilian female with a thick crest of bone along her head. She worked in the academy's maintenance division and rarely spoke during work hours. Most students ignored her, assuming she was below their intellectual station. Mark didn't share that arrogance. He greeted her in her language, a growling, guttural tongue that most translators struggled to parse. She paused, clearly startled, her pupils narrowing as she studied him. Then she replied, slowly, deliberately. Mark responded again, this time adjusting his vocal pitch to match the low, oscillating tone she used at the end of each sentence. She blinked in approval. They spoke for over an hour. He learned that her language had no fixed word for future, instead, it relied on metaphorical constructions that referred to environmental change, like, when the mountain shifts, or, when the river forgets its name. The philosophical implications fascinated him. He made mental notes as she spoke, careful not to interrupt. By the end of their exchange, she offered him a rough translation of a traditional poem passed down in her species, something she had never shared with anyone outside her kind. Later that day, Mark found himself drawn to the orbital transport bay, where supply ships docked and unloaded cargo for the academy. The workers there spoke a variant of Silese, a language characterized by hand gestures synchronized with rapid-fire speech. No translator had ever fully captured its grammar because meaning could change depending on the number of fingers shown or the orientation of the palm. Mark watched a group coordinate the unloading of a massive container, absorbing the cadence of their interactions. When the work was done, he approached one of the workers and asked if he had used the sign for heavy or unstable during the maneuver. The man, a broad-shouldered male with mechanical limbs, raised an eyebrow in surprise and confirmed it was unstable. Mark mimicked the sign back, this time adjusting the timing of his movement. The man grinned and offered him another, this time a more complex phrase involving danger and urgency. Within minutes, the two were exchanging full phrases through signs, bypassing speech altogether. By the fourth day, Mark's notebook had grown into a tangle of ideas. He didn't write linearly, instead, each page resembled a map of language evolution, a notation in one corner linked to a symbol 3 pages later. He created a web of associations, emotional context, cultural symbolism, environmental influence, all drawn from real-life encounters. He didn't just want to speak like these beings, he wanted to think like them. Meanwhile, the other students remained trapped in their digital realms. Sohn spent entire nights feeding simulations into her processor, refining predictive models for speech patterns. The Glut twins constructed a neural network so massive that it required its own cooling unit. Yet despite their sophistication, none of them had spoken a single sentence to Ray. None had ever exchanged signs with a dock worker or shared silence with the Aluan meditators in the temple garden. Mark's method didn't rely on tools, it relied on trust. Every interaction was a trade, curiosity for respect, patience for meaning. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't flawless, but it was real. That evening, as the stars rotated over the academy dome, Mark returned to his quarters. He was tired, not from data overload, but from the effort of absorbing experiences he could never explain in code. He set his journal on the desk and flipped to a clean page. There, he began sketching a conversation he had overheard between two instructors from the Dexter cluster. Their language was considered irregular, full of overlapping phrases and vocal modulations that confused most listeners. But Mark had picked out a pattern. They always began with a metaphor and ended with a shared reference. He tested the pattern with a few sample sentences and nodded to himself. It was consistent. He didn't notice the small camera light blinking in the corner of the room. Swan had planted it earlier, suspecting that Mark had somehow discovered a hidden AI. She watched him from her pod, waiting to catch him speaking into a secret translator or revealing a concealed neural implant. But all she saw was a human sketching language patterns with a pen. She narrowed her eyes in frustration. Primitive, she muttered. But something in her expression shifted. She couldn't deny the results. The next morning, Mark received a message from Professor Zeiler. It was simple, consisting of 4 glyphs in an ancient dialect long considered obsolete. Most would have needed a translator to read it. Mark replied in the same dialect, using the accepted form from 3 millennia prior. The professor didn't respond immediately, but when Mark arrived at class, the old being gave him a subtle nod, not approval, recognition. While the others prepared for simulation day, when prototypes would be tested in real-world environments, Mark continued his immersion. He joined a ritual ceremony held by the aquatic Nuans in their underwater chamber. Though he couldn't breathe in their atmosphere, he sat in the observation dome and mimicked the ritual's rhythmic chanting using a sound modulator. When a Nuan elder swam up to the glass and pressed his fin against it, Mark copied the gesture with his palm. The elder closed his eyes and pulsed his bioluminescent stripes, a clear signal of mutual understanding. Word of Mark's method spread. A few students began to pay attention. One even asked if she could accompany him on his next observation trip. He agreed. After all, language was meant to be shared, not downloaded but discovered. By the end of the week, Mark had mapped conversational structures in 9 dialects and could comfortably hold basic discussions in 6. He had developed muscle memory for hand sign phrases and could decode emotional subtext in 2 tone-based languages. He hadn't written a single line of code, but he had built something far more valuable, a living translator made not of metal or data, but of memory, attention, and empathy. He didn't yet know what Professor Zeiler had in mind for the next stage, but he was ready. And somewhere deep in the neural core of the academy, the old professor reviewed Mark's progress with quiet contemplation. Something ancient stirred within him. He had seen many students chase knowledge, this was the first time he saw one become it. The day began with a ceremonial stillness. Mark stood at the edge of the testing dome, a vast chamber carved into the academy's inner ring, where observation decks circled above like judgmental halos. He held nothing in his hands, no device, no screen, just his usual notebook, now half filled with intricate diagrams, alien song structures, and hand-sketched linguistic trees that only he could read fluently. He had arrived early, as usual, and had spent several minutes seated in quiet concentration. The chamber, cold and faintly humming, seemed to breathe with anticipation. Above him, the ceiling retracted, revealing a thick pane of reinforced transparisteel. Behind it sat the professors, their eyes gleaming, multifaceted or mechanical depending on their species. Each was here to evaluate the students' prototypes, expecting grand displays of tech complexity and precision. In the center of the dome stood 5 testing zones, each designated for a different communication task. The students would rotate through them, each trial designed to expose the strengths and weaknesses of their approach. The first trial required real-time translation of a rapidly spoken alien dialect during a simulated emergency. Mark was assigned to observe first. He watched as Sohn took the lead. Her neural processor blinked with energy as she connected her mind to the translator unit she had embedded into her upper spine. She activated her device and approached the holographic projection of a Pandrari civilian screaming in his native tongue. Within moments, her device produced output, words appeared on a screen, processed and adjusted. Her voice echoed the translation with only a few seconds delay. The professors nodded with interest. The crowd murmured in approval. The simulation ended with a near-perfect score. Mark was next. He stepped into the same zone. The hologram flickered to life, repeating the same panicked plea in fast, broken Drari. Mark said nothing for a few seconds. Instead, he tilted his head and watched the projection's eyes, noted the curvature of his shoulders, and listened to the breath between syllables. Then he began to speak, softly but confidently, in fluent Drexy. No delay. No machine. No tech. The hologram calmed. Mark repeated the phrase in a drear dialect specific to the northern marsh clans, matching inflection and emotional tone. The creature responded naturally, no longer appearing agitated. One of the professors leaned forward, another scribbled something furiously. When the simulation ended, Mark stepped back without bowing or waiting for applause. He had delivered what was asked. The silence in the chamber was louder than any ovation. The second trial involved the decoding of a tonal language used exclusively by the aquatic Nuans. It was performed in a water-filled resonance chamber using modified atmospheric pressure to simulate underwater acoustics. Most students connected their devices to translation relays. The twins from Gadari used a vibration-sensitive membrane they had engineered themselves. Their machine translated the tonal pulses into three-dimensional symbols projected in midair. Mark entered the water chamber barefoot, wearing a simple breathing collar. He submerged himself with slow movements, eyes closed, allowing the pressure to wash over his eardrums. When the Nuiwian elder began the test, singing a riddle encoded in 5 layers of pitch, Mark responded not with words but with a short series of hums, replicating the elder's tonal scale with near-perfect vibrational feedback. The elder, sensing true comprehension, altered the melody. Mark followed without hesitation. A brief pause, then the elder shifted again, this time introducing a historical variation known only to Nuiwian scholars. Mark's reply was exact. It wasn't that he had memorized the dialect, he had internalized the logic behind its structure. When he resurfaced, the chamber lights flickered to blue, a sign of ceremonial respect from the Nuiwian instructors. In the third zone, students faced a real-time negotiation between 2 hostile alien factions. The dialects overlapped in grammatical structure but had cultural tensions embedded into word choice. Mispronounce a single syllable and risk implying insult or war. The students relied heavily on their machines, algorithms handled the nuance. But nuance cannot always be calculated. Mark entered the zone calmly. 2 instructors, masked in ceremonial robes, acted out the roles of the diplomats. Mark greeted each with their traditional phrase, adjusting his posture and tone according to their customs. Then he listened, not just to their words but to their intent. When one delegate used a phrase that traditionally translated to sacrifice, Mark shifted the term in his interpretation to honor-bound offering, understanding that the literal version would be offensive to the other species. His adjustment wasn't programmed, it was instinctual, shaped by his days of sitting among those who used such words with layered meaning. The negotiation ended in consensus. The professors said nothing. In the fourth trial, the students had to decipher a dead language from partial glyphs scattered across a simulated archaeological dig. Here, even Mark faced a moment of uncertainty. The glyphs were from a long-extinct species known for their symbolic complexity. One sign could mean 5 different things depending on the direction of the moon during its carving. The other students fed images into their processors, hoping the machines would draw parallels with known symbols. Mark knelt beside the glyphs and stared at them for nearly 10 minutes. He didn't rush. He whispered fragments of languages he knew, watching for patterns. Then he noticed something, the repetition of a hook-shaped swirl at the end of each line. It wasn't a letter but a musical notation indicating rhythm in reading. He began to hum each glyph, responding to the previous like a stanza in a song. When he finished, he had translated a full sentence, an ancient blessing meant for those who dared to learn without fear. The professors, even the most skeptical, turned toward one another in quiet realization. The final trial was unexpected. Professor Zeiler himself descended from the observation deck. The chamber dimmed as he entered, casting a bluish glow across the floor. He walked toward Mark, holding nothing in his hands. "The test," he said, "is no longer about devices." The dome sealed behind them. A new being entered, unknown to the others, a traveler from a deep sector world recently discovered. Her language was undocumented, unrecorded, and completely foreign. She stood silently, tense and alert, eyes scanning the chamber. Her race had refused to allow translators to observe her speech, no algorithms had been approved for development. This was no simulation. This was the real test. Mark approached slowly, hands visible, posture relaxed. He spoke nothing. He mimicked her breathing pace. Then he knelt, not as submission but as invitation. She blinked, then clicked her fingers in a slow rhythm. Mark echoed it. She made a noise in her throat, soft and clipped. Mark repeated it with slight hesitation, then tried again with corrected pitch. She narrowed her eyes, then nodded once. The exchange deepened. It lasted 10 minutes. There were no spectators now, only witnesses. Mark shifted his body in a circle, then tapped the ground, imitating a pattern she had embedded into her response cycle. She paused, then did the same. Eventually, she reached forward and placed her palm against his chest, an unmistakable sign in most cultures of shared trust. When it ended, she looked up at Professor Zeiler and spoke in her own tongue, pointing to Mark, then tapping her heart. The professor translated her intent aloud, "This one listens not with ears, with being." The chamber filled with silence. Mark said nothing as he stepped back. The moment needed no embellishment. His method, once dismissed, had done what the machines could not. He had connected with someone whom no one else could understand. The trials were over. The results were unwritten but undeniable. The storm didn't come immediately. For the first few hours after the final trial, the Academy's corridors pulsed with a strange silence. Whispers were replaced by glances. Words were measured, held back, trapped behind unreadable expressions. Mark moved through the halls without ceremony, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place. But even he could feel it in the air. Something had shifted. He returned to his study pod, unaware that the tide he had stirred was gathering force just beyond the polished walls of the upper observatory wing. In the private conference chamber above the testing dome, 4 senior members of the Academy faculty gathered. Professor Zeiler stood at the edge of the projection circle, his limbs folded neatly, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood Professor Neer, a crystalline being whose voice could only be transmitted via light pulses, and Professor Yudin, a bloated scion who had published over 50 treatises on the superiority of machine-based linguistics. The fourth, Professor Mirera, a soft-spoken historian from the Avanar race, said little but watched everything. Professor Yudin's voice shook the chamber first. "This human, this Mark, he bypasses protocols, ignores methodology.